handout that you should be able to find at some place. I don't know exactly where that's going to be yet. If you are watching us on our YouTube, please don't forget to like the YouTube channel and subscribe to the YouTube channel. When you subscribe to a channel on YouTube, YouTube will then alert you and tell you when new content has been added. So we're going to add this entire lesson, we hope, over the next, I don't know how many weeks. I'm not even going to tell you how many weeks it's going to be. I can't tell you. But we're going to add these content, and hopefully we're going to be adding this content on Wednesday. So of those of you who are here in person, if you can't be here, you can always just catch up on the online event. Also, if you're online, tell us who you are and where you're watching from, because we're fascinated about that sort of thing. For the introduction to the book of Revelation, first of all, the book of Revelation is written by the Apostle John. John was the youngest of the disciples. We think he to be about 16. He's in his early teens during Jesus' ministry, which is why the book is written so late. Most of us believe that the book of Revelation is the last of the letters to be written, which is why it's at the end of the book. Doesn't have anything to do with eschatology, doesn't have anything to do with the end times, doesn't have anything to do with that. John's letter to his churches should be read in the same light, in the same context as Paul when he writes his letters to his church, or when Peter writes his letters to the churches. The Apostle Paul took over a pastoral position in Ephesus at about 70 AD. This included what you might call a bishopship-like position for the surrounding areas. These were the 7 churches of Asia Minor, and he is based in Ephesus, and then there are pastors at each one of those churches, and he oversees them, guides them, works with them. They're probably not interacting on a daily or even weekly basis. Maybe monthly, maybe yearly they come. These are probably all preachers who have been trained by John himself, which would be really great. Could you imagine being trained to be a pastor by John, who was trained to be a pastor by Jesus? Think of the stories he has. So as he is the bishop of these churches, the Roman Emperor Nero has persecuted the church. Now Nero begins the persecution of the church, but he doesn't perfect it. The perfection is done by the guy who succeeds him, and his name is Domitian. Domitian becomes the emperor somewhere around 81 to 96 AD. I get the ADs and the BCs mixed up. I got to run it through my head. At this point, the persecution of the church is intensified. Domitian is a cold-blooded murderer. He's also in love with himself. He's a narcissist, like most emperors are, to tell you the truth. He is the one who sort of intensified the persecution against the Christians because he also believes himself, and I can't imagine that he really believes this, but he believes himself to be God. He is one of the big ones to initiate emperor worship. When you address Domitian, you had to address him as my Lord and my God, Domitian. He was bitter in his treatment with both Jews and Christians. In fact, historians sometimes think his big fight sort of was with Jews. And at the time, Romans don't see a differentiation between Jews and Christians. Christians are just another sect of Judaism. It was at his behest that John was exiled to the Isle of Patmos, which is a rocky island in the Aegean Sea. It's about 10 miles long and about 6 miles wide, and Rome had a penal camp there. You can see the Aegean Sea. I couldn't find a map that had the Isle of Patmos sort of set there, but he had taken him out of his job and sent him into exile. Here, on this desolate spot, John receives the visions that make up the book of Revelation. We believe it was written about 95 AD. Now, if Christ had died if Christ dies when he's about 32, or in 32, and John was 16 when Jesus dies, that puts John at about 80 at the writing of this book. He is long in the tooth, so to speak. I'd say he's old, but there's 80-year-olds around here, and I don't want to get in trouble. Give or take 3 or 4 years on either side. The purpose of the book. This is a good one. Revelation is addressed to the 7 churches of Asia Minor. This is their pastor, their bishop, writing them a letter. It's a real letter. He is actually there on Patmos, and he is actually writing to his parishioners. Call it a newsletter article if you want. But they're real people at a real place and at a real time. It is a complete letter. It has an opening. It has a closing. It has a benediction. The situation that calls forth for the writing of the letter made clear by the letter itself. He tells us why he's writing to us. Chapter 2, verse 6, the churches are being troubled by false teachers. The biggest problem that pastors always have is when you're not around, you have no idea what's going on, right? The cat's away, the mice will play. They are being influenced by false teachers. Chapter 2, verse 9 also says that the synagogue of Satan, which are the Jews are harassing them as well. And they are also undergoing, Revelation chapter 1, verse 9, a persecution. So you have the Romans persecuting us. You have heretics inside the church teaching false doctrine. And you have the Jews who are giving us a hard time in the first place. All of this is weighing on John. And so he writes a letter in order to encourage the church, to encourage those of whom he is working for. To these churches, John himself, in banishment on the Isle of Patmos, writes on account of the Word of God, the testimony of Jesus Christ. He writes on account of the visions that were given unto him, and there the record of revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave to him, shows his servant. So this is Revelation chapter 1, verse 1. It is the revelation. Again, one of my pet peeves, I really hate the word revelations. It's not plural. It's singular. It's important because we get deep into the book of Revelation and you see dragons and angels and stars and bonfires and beasties and all of this stuff, and you're like, oh, these are the revelations. These are not the revelations. There is one revelation, and that revelation is the Son of God, Jesus Christ. The book is about who? Jesus. Okay. He writes in order to strengthen the congregation because they're enduring trials. He writes to hold before them the greatness of our God. And number 3, to assure them of the victory of Jesus Christ over the powers of hell, sin, Satan, and the world. They are being beaten and battered on all sides, and their pastor preaches, Jesus! Jesus has got this under control. I know you don't see it. I know you don't understand everything that's going on, but Jesus is in control. It is the very same message that pastors are preaching to their churches today. In the middle of the 2020 pandemic, we are saying, God has got it under control. Be calm. The book is thoroughly practical. Like all of the books of the Bible, it is designed to be read. It is designed to be read in the worship. It is to be useful. The first of the 7 Beatitudes from the book pronounces and shows. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of prophecy, and blessed are those who hear, who keep the word as is written thereon, for the time is near. Is the time near? It is. It's always near. It's always been near. It's nearer today than it was yesterday. But even for John's church, he says the time is near. We'll get more into that later on. Time and place of writing. We already talked a little bit about that. Just a little bit of evidence. Irenaeus, which is one of the early church fathers, in his book Against Heresies, states point blank that Revelation was written towards the end of the close of the reign of Domitian, which is 81 to 96, which gives us a most probable date of somewhere around 95 or 96. We got a couple of pictures here of busts of Nero and Domitian. I like the one with Nero because isn't he just the ugliest of emperors? You would think the Romans would come up with a better looking cat to run their empire, but nope. Whereas Domitian is, they're like, all right, we're done with Nero. Let's get a better looking guy up there. Domitian was the first Roman emperor to make a huge issue out of emperor worship. And since the emperor's cult was propagated with great zeal in Asia Minor, a collision between the cult of the empire and the now illegalized Christianity was bound to happen. Remember, when Jesus is on the earth, Judaism is legal. And the Roman Empire, they had legal religions and they had illegal religions. Judaism was a legal religion, and that continued until about 70 A.D. At that point, the Jews revolted against Rome, and when you revolt against Rome, Rome makes you illegal. And so they legalized them, and at this point, we're still in that. And the Romans don't care if you're Jewish or Christian. They don't see the difference. They don't care about the difference. You're one or the other. You're either legal or illegal. And at this time, we're sort of in that point where we're an illegal religion, but we still keep going. We're not with them. We're our own thing. And Jews in private are going, they're not with us. We don't know who these people are. John is banished to the Isle of Patmos on account of the Word of God, Revelation chapter 1, verse 9. And so we're going to just sort of leave that. So the Christian church has got a problem in the fact that divine honors for the emperor are used almost as a loyalty test. If you'll say, Domitian is my Lord and my God, you're in. If you're like, well, I can't say that, you're out, right? There's a test. Literature. Revelation is a really interesting book because of its visions, right? We have visions of riders, we have visions of trumpets, we have visions of bowls and dragons. It is mysterious, it is suggestive, it strikes the modern reader as strange, it strikes us as being downright bizarre at times. There are many, including Luther, who wrote, "My spirit cannot adapt itself unto this book." He just couldn't deal with it. I think Luther had bigger things to deal with in his life and his ministry, and so he'd come to Revelation and go, I don't know. He'd throw up his hands and go deal with another problem. So much of the book puzzles us today, but so much of the book of Revelation that puzzles us today, I believe, would have been easily understood by John's pastors and the people that he led. And I say that because John is writing a letter to people that he knows. And so when he uses symbols, he's going to use symbols that they know. Occasionally, your pastor talks about things that you don't know about, but that's the pastor's fault. I think John knows his people pretty well. John's book is a piece of literature that we call apocalyptical. Apocalyptic literature is elaborated by certain elements and aspects of the Old Testament. If you really want to learn more about apocalyptic literature, you can read the book of Isaiah, chapters 24 and 29, Zechariah, chapter 9 through 14, most of Ezekiel, most of Joel, and a whole bunch of Daniel. The problem that we have with apocalyptic literature is the fact that we as a society don't read it anymore. So we don't know how to approach it, and we don't know how to read it. If I were to give you a Nancy Drew book, you would know how to read that, right? Because a Nancy Drew book is a whodunit. It's a mystery. And we know that you're supposed to sort of figure that out to a certain extent. I like to read fantasy books, and I know how those are supposed to work out. You get a teenager probably some wool-headed boy who has no idea who he is, 90% chance he's been adopted. Come to find out, he's actually related to who? Whoever's the king. He's the long-lost king. So you get this kid who doesn't have any idea what's going on. He has to go on a journey. On the journey, he meets friends. He helps people out of the goodness of his heart. Later on, those friends become very important. They help him. He grows. He learns. He's challenged. And then he takes on the big bad guy in the last couple of chapters. And he wins. Yeah, this is what I like about fantasy literature. He normally wins. John's book of apocalyptic literature is a gigantic work. And it is a gigantic work because he is incorporating all of human history and encapsulating it down into one little letter. And he's doing all of it in a Christocentric light. Jesus is the light of the world. Revelation is especially interested in eschatology. That is, the end of history and ushering in a new world to come. To do that, John uses pictures. He uses allegories. He uses symbols, numbers, colors, stars, all of which I believe are accessible to the reader. When I was in worked in Atlanta, right after 9/11, there was a neighbor of mine, and I would walk my little neighborhood, and outside the front of his house, he put this flag. And I looked at that flag and went, that's pretty gutsy to put up a Muslim flag. In the middle of what's been going on, I don't know what's going on in that house, but so I stopped and said a little prayer that the mob would not come after this guy's house, because I had no idea. The thing of it is, other flags I've seen sort of look like that, right? When you see a crescent moon and a palm tree, if I see a palm tree on a flag, I'm thinking Middle East. And if I see a crescent moon, I'm thinking about the Nation of Islam. That red flag is actually the American Nation of Islam flag. Except after you get to know that blue one is, what's the blue flag stand for? Oh, South Carolina. That's where after I moved to South Carolina, I realized that was the state flag, South Carolina. I'm a little embarrassed to tell you that I didn't initially know so anyway. And then you find that that's not really a palm tree. That is a palmetto tree, which is completely different. I mean, it's a palm tree, but it is a specific palm tree. And that crescent moon is not a crescent moon. It's a piece of armor. It's a what? A cordo. Yeah. It's a piece of armor. But it looks like a crescent moon to me. My point is, if you don't know what the symbols are, it's really easy to go in a completely different direction. So that's why we pay so much time and interest on the symbols. Another good pieces of apocalyptic literature, the book of Enoch, the book of Jubilees, the book of Esdras, the Assumption of Moses, most of which none of you have ever read. Some of this stuff we did read about 3 or 4 years ago. We read some of this stuff. Formally, Revelation belongs to a class of literature we call apocalyptical. However, Revelation is set apart from your general run-of-the-mill apocalyptic literature by profound differences. Number one, this draws super heavily upon the Old Testament. It doesn't draw from any other sort of places. It draws most of its theology from the Old Testament, we'll get into that. John draws very heavily from the Old Testament. Even in John's Gospel, he draws real heavily from the Old Testament. No other New Testament book can compare with the number of allusions to the Old Testament and alliterations to the Old Testament as the book of John. Revelation is saturated with Old Testament theology. In fact, It is the Old Testament itself, not other works of apocalyptic literature, that constitute the immediate background and the richest sources for understanding what's going on in the book of Revelation. If you want to understand what's going on in the book of Revelation, a lot of times you need to go back and be thoroughly immersed in the Old Testament, because John is a child of the Old Testament. Apocalyptic works are generally pseudonymous. Got to read that word. Generally, what happens with an apocalyptical work is that somebody in the 300s will write about things that happened in the 200s and attribute it to somebody who was alive in the 100s. Meaning that the person who was alive in the 100s, guess what? They could foresee the future. No, they couldn't, because the person who actually wrote it in the 300s and then attributed it to the guy from the 100s. That's not what we have in the book of Revelation. In the book of Revelation, John is writing the book in the later end of Domitian's period. So he's not, from the 600s and somebody else wrote this book and then point it back to him. Okay? Apocalyptical literature seeks to spark interest. It cultivates themes and seasons about the world's end. John has no speculative interest in any of this. He does not claim or aim to satisfy anybody's curiosity. He is writing to give them hope. He is writing to give them courage in the midst of their present dilemma, which are enemies from the inside, enemies from the outside, and a persecution to boot. He does not attempt to calculate the approach of the end of the world. John writes, Jesus says, I come quickly. This is the burden of revelation of Christ as given to John. Live as if Jesus will come back tomorrow. Because he might. Just because it's been 2,000 years doesn't mean it won't be tomorrow. But it also may be another 2,000 years. But go ahead and live like he's coming today. The visions of the apocalypse betray their origins in a lot of apocalyptic literature is completely and utter fanciful. It's fantasy. The visions of John have a genuine stamp of visionary experience because they're backed up in the theology and the visions of the Old Testament. The Lord is speaking through the eyes of John, through the tongues of men, but he does not think in the ways that men think. Going to the content of John, Revelation is a carefully constructed and it is an elaborately articulate whole over which the number 7 is dominant. The number 7 is the big number, right? The number 7 is the number of perfection. Why? You have the 4 corners of creation, north, south, east, and west, 4 corners of the world, and then the 3 of the Trinity. Creation, creator. That's the whole. In the beginning, God created the world. It took him 6 days, and on the 7th day, he rested. That takes us on to the 8th day of creation, right? 6 days of creation, 1 day of rest. The 8th day of creation is the day of resurrection. So you have 7 days of creation, and then you have the day of God. Gives us to 8 days. The same thing's going on in the book of Revelation. We're going to see that number and derivations of the number 7 over and over and over again. You've got 3 days in the Old Testament, 3 days in the New Testament, and we're waiting on that one final day, which is the day that Christ comes. And you will see him riding in the clouds. Lift up your heads. Your salvation has come. And after that, new heaven and new earth. Redemption goes along with that 8 days of creation. You can see this over and over and over again. The outline of the whole work is visions of 7. We have 3 cycles of visions of 7. We also seem to be very clear that there's a major break between the 3rd and the 4th vision. It's important to understand that the whole is observed, that each unit, it spans a whole period between the presence and then the return of our Lord Jesus, so that we have a set of parallel representations which represent the same facts, right? We get one cycle of 7, then we get another cycle of 7, and then we get this, what we call in the interregnum, and then you get another cycle of 7. All right, the whole idea is the pattern. We're going to watch the pattern unfold before us. And there's a progression in the sense of all things is portrayed with an increase of fullness as the visions progress. Now, let's talk about what the book is not. Let me just say this before we get too deep into it. Good and godly and honest theologians and scholars can disagree on the meaning of the book of Revelation because it is so sort of out there, right? There's not a lot that helps us to reinterpret after what we've read. 4 broad interpretations have been suggested. The preterist is the Latin word from preter, which means the past. This approach states that everything in the book took place in the 1st century, that John is actually writing to the church in code about what's going on with the emperor and Domitian and other things going around. John deals, they say, with the war between the church and Rome, that he write to the saints to comfort them, to encourage them in their time of persecution. But John states 7 times that he's writing prophecy. Certainly, the book has a special value to those enduring the Roman persecution, but its value does not cease at the close of the apostolic age. It has a value to us. If he's writing just a letter to them about what's going on to them, it wouldn't have any value to us. That is not the way God writes books. God writes books that have value to the people that read the book, but it also has value going forward. The second one is historical. The historical interpretation claims to see the fulfillment of the church history in the symbols of Revelation. They believe that the book outlines a course of history from the apostolic times to the current ages. They search history books to find events to parallel those books in Revelation. Sometimes the results are absolutely disastrous. One interpreter sees Luther and the Reformation in this symbol, but another interpreter sees the Counter-Reformation in another symbol. To another student, the symbol stands for the invention of the printing press. To another, the beast is your Social Security card. Y'all remember that back in the day? When they came out with the Social Security cards, they're like, oh my goodness, you can't get a Social Security card because that's the number of the beast. Now we all have Social Security cards, we don't think anything about it. Now the new one is Google Pay, right? If you take the Google Pay, or you get the chip, or you get the this or the that, you see how I always poo-poo all of these things. I want to stay on a cash basis because I like cash, because when I'm out of cash, I can't spend any more money. I like to use that with my wife, too. I give her the money that she's got, and when she's out of it, you can't spend anymore. I don't like the little tapping your phone to things. Karen has noticed this as well. Karen's trying to keep her expenses down because now that she's gone to Google Pay, it's like, I'll get the coffee today, I'll get the coffee, I'll buy this, I'll buy that. And this is what merchants want us. They don't want us thinking about how much it costs. They just want us to spend. My question here on, with the historical method, what value would Revelation be to believers today if in John's day all it did was foretell what was going to happen? This is why we call it historical, that he's saying, this is what's going to happen in the future, but now that it's already happened, so we look back at it and go, okay, it's a history book. The third thing, the futurist, this is by far the one that you will see the most. The futurists are the left behind guys, the rapture guys. You ever see the bumper sticker? It says, in case of the rapture, this car will be driverless. Because that sounds like God, right? To just let cars go careening off the interstate. Because he's like, well, I'm going to take the driver of this, and the two kids in the back, they weren't baptized. Well, they'll just have to fend for themselves. Sounds like God, doesn't it? I'm being facetious. Just for the record. The futurist, this school emphasizes that Revelation is prophecy. Chapter 6 through 22 describes scenes and scenarios and events that will transpire on earth and in heaven when the prophecy after the church is raptured. While the students gladly recognize the spiritual lessons of the book, they also recognize that the book talks about actual events that will be fulfilled one day. If Revelation is not to be interpreted as prophecy, then God is not going to give the church a book in the New Testament to explain the future of the world, the course of human events, the victory of the church, the judgment of sin, the fulfillment of the promises, the prophecies of the Old Testament. The futurists believe that Revelation is God showing his hand, so to speak, an outline of God's program for human history. What began in ages ago in the first creation will ultimately be completed in a new creation, and it shows us history as being God's story, and human affairs are in the hands of this victorious Christ. You see, the problem with the historical view and the futurist view is the very same problem. In the historical view, they look back and go, look at all this stuff that happened. Ooh. And it doesn't really have any value for us today. The futurists have the same thing. Is they turn around, they look forward to all of this stuff that's going to happen. They're like, oh, look at all that prophecy that's going to happen. By the way, be scared of it and buy my book so that you'll know what's going to happen when it all happens. But again, that really doesn't have any value for our spiritual life today either. So I disregard the historical portion. I disregard the futurist portion. The preterist, which is really just the past anyway, saying that it only had something to do with that first century. And the course that we take is what we call the spiritualist. Now, I'm a spiritualist, but not a mystic. That does not mean I'm a Rastafarian. I am not buddies with Rasputin. But what we mean here is the realization that the book of Revelation is prophecy. Now, the Old Testament prophets did foretell the future. We all know that happened, that they did foretell the future. But that wasn't all they did. Most of the Old Testament prophets, although occasionally would foretell the future, most of the time they were preaching to the people in that situation that day. In the New Testament church, we would call them preachers, right? You can profess the future, but still preach the gospel. Most of what the book of Revelation is the preaching of the revelation of Jesus Christ. It is prophetic, but that's not all it is. It's also preaching. So in order to sort of understand the book of Revelation, we have to somehow be able to wrestle ourselves away from the idea that this is all prophecy and redeem that time with saying this is also the preaching of Jesus Christ. We see Revelation as a symbolic representation of the conflict between Satan and Christ. It is a conflict between good and evil. We reject the idea that John writes about actual events as they can be nailed down in our time. That's not meaning that they're not actual events. John talks about the day of the Lord a lot. And when is the day of the Lord? Well, it's going to be different. It's going to be subjective, right? The day of the Lord is going to be subjective as to where you are in time, right? Has there ever been a plague on mankind? Absolutely. It's 2020, by the way. We're in the middle of a pandemic. There's a whole bunch of people wearing masks right now. Is this the great pandemic of our day? Well, of course not. If you live in Africa, the great pandemic of your day actually happened a couple of years with Ebola, which was significantly more dangerous and deadly to them. Let's not forget about the plague that hit Europe, the yellow fever that hit Charleston in the 1800s. You know, all of these symbols, all of these great days, all of these floods and these earthquakes, and all of them that happened, they have happened, they will happen, and they continue to happen. In Somerville, we can talk about the 100-year flood, and everybody knows about it because it happened to us. If you go to someplace, if you go up into the river in the Midwest and talk about the 100-year flood, they're probably still going to remember a flood, but it's not the same flood. Depends on where you are and when you are. Stuff happens. Stuff is going to happen. It continues to happen. How do you deal with it is what John is trying to get across to his churches as they endure persecution and Domitian and the synagogue of Satan, so to speak. Prophecy is much more than telling the future. Prophecy is the proclamation of the Word of God. As Moses said, "Oh, how I wished all of God's people were prophets." Jeremiah 31:31 reads, "And the Lord said, the time will surely come when I will make a new agreement with the people of Israel and Judah. It will be different than the agreement that I made with their ancestors when I led them out of Egypt. Though I was their God, they broke that agreement. Here is the new agreement that I, the Lord, will make with the people of Israel. I will write my laws in their hearts and on their minds, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they have to teach one another, saying, 'Obey me.' I, the Lord, promise that all of them will obey me, ordinary people and rulers alike. I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sins no more." While we realize that Revelation does contain many basic principles in symbolic form, we must also admit that the book deals with real events that will one day take place and have taken place and continue to take place in the world. But the fact is, we're not supposed to have seen, or we will continue to see stuff happening, and that will be our song. Things happen. Be about the things of Christ. Okay? As we talked about, you can go ahead and study Jeremiah 31:31 again. We believe that that era has now happened, right? You had an Old Testament era. The crucifixion, the resurrection of Jesus intercedes and brings about the New Testament era, and we are in that New Testament era, the era that Revelation is talking about. Okay? We're going to stop the video there. Thank you all.